The Lighthouse Postcard, Chapter 1. The Impossible Arrival. The dull thud of the mail slot in Olivia Martin's San Francisco apartment on a Tuesday morning was usually the mundane soundtrack to another day of bills and junk mail. Olivia, at 40, was a documentary photographer, known for her stark, almost clinical landscapes of urban decay. Her art as detached and unsentimental as her life. 25 years ago, she had lost her beloved grandfather, Theodore Martin, the only person who had brought warmth and wonder into her childhood. His death, sudden and inexplicable, had left an aching void, a bitter cynicism, and a profound sense of unfinished business that she buried deep beneath layers of professionalism. She collected the usual stack from the doormat: glossy advertisements, a utility bill, a credit card offer, and then, at the bottom of the pile, something else. Something utterly out of place. It was an old postcard, yellowed and brittle with age, its edges softened by time. The front depicted a faded image of a lighthouse, rugged and solitary against a stormy sky. The North Lighthouse, a place she and grandfather Ted had visited countless times during her summers at his cabin in Northern California. Her heart gave a sudden, unexpected lurch. On the reverse, in a familiar, elegant script she hadn't seen in a quarter century, were a few simple lines. "My dearest Liv, don't forget the secret of the North Lighthouse. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight. With love, Grandfather Ted." And then the postmark. Her breath hitched. It was dated a specific day, 25 years ago, the exact day Grandfather Ted had died. Her mind reeled. This was impossible. A postcard, written by a man who had been gone for a quarter of a century, arriving in her mailbox on a Tuesday morning. It defied every law of logic, every tenet of the rational world she inhabited. Yet here it was, tangible proof of the impossible. Her hands trembled, the postcard fluttering slightly. The cold, detached photographer felt a strange warmth spread through her, a mixture of disbelief and a profound, aching tenderness. He was gone. He had been gone, but this felt like a hand reaching out across time, a final, whispered message from the one person who had truly understood her. This impossible arrival, a phantom limb of the past, forced Olivia to confront not only her grandfather's hidden truth, but also her own long-buried emotions, shattering the carefully constructed walls of her cynicism. The journey had begun, not with a choice, but with a ghost in her mailbox, a sign that the past is never truly gone. Chapter 2. The Bureaucracy of Miracles. The postcard felt like a fragile, ancient relic in Olivia's trembling hands. It was a tangible paradox, an echo of a life extinguished a quarter century ago. Her pragmatic mind screamed impossible, but her heart, a muscle she rarely acknowledged, felt a flicker of something long forgotten. Hope. She had to know. Her first stop was the main post office downtown, a hulking, concrete edifice that felt as impersonal as bureaucracy itself. She approached the counter, the yellowed postcard clutched tight. "This arrived today," she began, her voice betraying a tremor she struggled to control. "But the postmark, it's from 25 years ago." The young clerk behind the counter, a bored teenager chewing gum, barely glanced up. "Lost mail happens, man. Sometimes things get stuck. Happens all the time." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, clearly uninterested in the emotional weight of her impossible delivery. Olivia, however, was not so easily deterred. She insisted, her voice gaining strength, her documentarian's resolve kicking in. This is more than just lost mail. This is from someone who died 25 years ago. I need to know how this is possible. Her persistence eventually led her to a back office to Mrs. Evelyn Stone, a woman of indeterminate age with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense bun, perched behind a desk piled high with ancient ledgers. Mrs. Stone listened to Olivia's story with a surprising lack of skepticism, a flicker of something akin to recognition in her eyes. "Ah, yes, the old ones," Mrs. Stone said, her voice raspy from years of disuse. "We found a batch of them a few months back, up in the attic archives. Old postal bag thought to be empty, stuck behind some defunct machinery. Must have been there for decades, just sitting, waiting." She explained that when they had renovated the building's old wing, they'd unearthed a stash of misdirected mail, some dating back even further. She confirmed that a small pile of postcards, including one bearing a familiar image of the North Lighthouse, had been among them. "Your grandfather, Theodore Martin, yes?" she mused, a faint smile touching her lips. "He was a peculiar man. Your grandfather, always sending unusual mail. Sometimes he'd just come in, stand by the counter, and tell stories about the sea, about messages carried by the wind. He liked to send things that were meant to arrive when they were ready." Mrs. Stone's words sent a shiver down Olivia's spine. Meant to arrive when they were ready. It sounded exactly like something Grandfather Ted would say. He had always been full of whimsical notions, strange tales of hidden messages and forgotten treasures. He'd spend hours poring over old maps, his fingers tracing imaginary routes across ancient seas. He believed in signs, in fate, in the magic that lay just beneath the surface of the ordinary. Olivia, even as a cynical adult, remembered his infectious wonder. The old post office employee leaned forward, her voice dropping. "He used to come in, just before, well, he'd mail these postcards, often to himself, sometimes to places nobody lived anymore. He'd say, sometimes the most important messages are the ones that take the longest journey." She paused, a faraway look in her eyes. "He was a good man, your grandfather, and he always had a purpose, even in his eccentricity." Olivia left the post office with a sense of dizzying disorientation. The rational explanation of lost mail was there, but it felt thin, inadequate. The postcard was not just a random piece of delayed post. It was a deliberate message, carefully crafted, patiently waiting 25 years for its moment to arrive. And Mrs. Stone's subtle confirmation of Grandfather Ted's purpose, his belief in messages that arrived when they were ready, transformed a mundane, bureaucratic encounter into the first step of a deeper, more personal quest. The lighthouse beckoned, a silent beacon across time, hinting at a truth far greater than mere coincidence. Chapter 3: The Echoes of a Lighthouse Child. The North Lighthouse postcard, no longer just a piece of delayed mail, had become a tangible link to a past Olivia had tried to bury. Mrs. Stone's words about Grandfather Ted's purpose and his belief in messages meant to arrive when they were ready resonated deeply, chipping away at Olivia's carefully constructed cynicism. She found herself, for the first time in years, consciously sifting through the archives of her own memory. Her childhood summers spent at Grandfather Ted's rustic cabin in the wild, untamed forests of Northern California flooded back. He was a man steeped in stories, his voice raspy with the tang of the sea, even though he'd never been a sailor. His small, cluttered cabin was filled with nautical charts, worn leather-bound books on maritime history, and an eclectic collection of antique instruments, sextants, spyglasses, and the faint scent of salt and old wood. The North Lighthouse was their sanctuary, their sacred place. It stood sentinel on a windswept bluff, its beam cutting through the Pacific fog. Grandfather Ted would take her there every Sunday, their hands clasped, his large calloused fingers enveloping her small ones. He'd tell her tales of shipwrecked sailors, of messages in bottles, of heroes who guided ships through treacherous storms. "Live," he'd say, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes the biggest truths aren't written in history books. They're whispered by the wind, carved into old stones, or hidden in plain sight." He had a particular fascination with hidden messages and treasures, not of gold, but of knowledge, of forgotten stories. He'd make her search for clues in the patterns of seashells on the beach, or in the cryptic carvings on old driftwood. He'd hide little notes around the cabin, sending her on treasure hunts that always ended with a new book or a shared story. The postcard's cryptic phrase, "Truth hides in plain sight," brought a sudden, startling memory, a gift. Right before his death, Grandfather Ted had given her a small, vintage brass spyglass. "A looking glass for your heart, Liv," he'd said, his voice unusually grave. "Remember, it shows you what truly matters." After he passed, Olivia had kept it, but tucked it away in a dusty box of childhood mementos, seeing it as nothing more than a sentimental trinket. Now, spurred by the postcard, she rummaged through the box, pulling out the small telescope. It felt cool and smooth in her hand, heavier than she remembered. She twisted the eyepiece, aiming it at the window. As she adjusted it, her finger brushed against a barely perceptible seam on the barrel. A secret compartment. Her breath hitched. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was not gold, but a miniature, intricately folded piece of parchment. It was not in Grandfather Ted's hand. It was much older, the ink faded, the script almost illegible. A single, cryptic phrase was discernible. "The stone of the guardian." Beneath the turning eye. The stone of the guardian. The turning eye. The lighthouse. Grandfather Ted had been obsessed with the lighthouse's history. He'd often speak of the old lighthouse keepers, spinning tales of their solitary lives, their unwavering dedication. But he had never mentioned working there himself. Olivia's cynicism began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of wonder and urgency. This was no coincidence. Grandfather Ted had meticulously planned this. A trail of breadcrumbs leading her back to a secret he desperately wanted her to find. The spyglass, a seemingly innocent gift, was a hidden key, and the cryptic message within it was a direct invitation to unravel the deeper mystery. She realized she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who understood the pursuit of a story, someone with an open mind. She thought of Matt, her colleague, a photojournalist known for his passion for uncovering forgotten narratives. The echoes of her lighthouse childhood were now guiding her towards a truth far more profound than she could have imagined. Chapter 4. An unlikely ally and a buried past. The antique spyglass, with its hidden parchment and cryptic message, solidified Olivia's conviction. This wasn't mere coincidence or delayed mail. It was a carefully orchestrated trail left by her grandfather, a posthumous treasure hunt. The stone of the guardian beneath the turning eye pointed unequivocally to the North Lighthouse, but the old script, the intricate layers of secrecy, hinted at a story far deeper than personal sentiment. Olivia knew she needed a partner, someone who could see beyond the immediate, someone who embraced the pursuit of truth with the same intensity she now felt. She called Matt. Matt was a fellow photojournalist, but where Olivia sought the stark, the detached, Matt was drawn to the human story, the hidden narratives, the threads that connected past and present. He was also a self-proclaimed enthusiast of urban legends and historical oddities. She met him for coffee, the spyglass and its parchment laid carefully between them. Matt listened, his usual easy smile slowly fading, replaced by a look of intense concentration. When Olivia finished, he picked up the parchment, his fingers tracing the ancient script. "Liv," he said, his voice hushed. "This is incredible. Your grandfather, he was a true storyteller, even in death." He immediately grasped the weight of the situation, the blend of personal history and a larger, unknown mystery. Their joint investigation began. Matt, with his journalistic contacts and research skills, started digging into the history of the North Lighthouse. What they uncovered was startling. Grandfather Ted, a man Olivia had always known as a gentle recluse, had indeed worked as a lighthouse keeper there. Briefly, in the months leading up to his death, he had never mentioned it to her or to anyone else in the family. It was a significant period, but one shrouded in mystery. Their search led them to the dusty archives of the local historical society in the small coastal town nearest the lighthouse. There, they found old logbooks, faded newspaper clippings, and even a few sepia photographs of the lighthouse keepers. And among them, a faded photograph of Grandfather Ted, looking younger, more focused, standing on the lighthouse catwalk, a determined glint in his eye. He was holding something in his hand, a small, leather-bound journal. "The stone of the guardian," Matt mused, tracing the phrase on the parchment. Lighthouses often have cornerstones, foundation stones, and the turning eye, that's the light itself, the mechanism. They decided to visit the lighthouse, but before they left the small town, Matt suggested they speak to a local, a man known as Old Henry. Henry was a former fisherman, a grizzled old-timer who lived near the docks, known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the town's maritime history and its characters. He was a gruff man, reluctant to speak to outsiders, but Matt's persistent charm eventually won him over. Henry eyed them suspiciously. "You're asking about Ted Martin? A good man, that one. But he had a bee in his bonnet, he did, always poking around where he shouldn't." He recounted how Grandfather Ted had become obsessed with a local legend, a ship, the Sea Serpent, that had gone down off the coast of the North Lighthouse during World War II. It wasn't just a regular cargo ship. It was rumored to be carrying something important, something more than just supplies. "A secret cargo," Henry muttered, "something the bigwigs wanted kept quiet. Whispers of a message, a code, meant to change the tide of the war." Henry also spoke of Grandfather Ted's frantic last months. He was on edge, Ted was. Said he was close to finding something. Felt like time was running out. Said he had to finish what he started, for old time's sake. He was spending all his time at that lighthouse, night and day, even when he wasn't on duty. And then, he just vanished. They said he drowned, a rogue wave. But I always wondered. Henry's eyes, rheumy with age, held a flicker of deep suspicion. He wasn't a man to be caught unaware by a wave, not Ted. He knew those waters better than anyone. Olivia felt a cold dread creep into her stomach. A secret cargo, a message, Grandfather Ted's obsession, his uncharacteristic silence about working at the lighthouse, and then his sudden, inexplicable death. The postcard, delayed for 25 years, was not just a sentimental message. It was a desperate, final attempt to pass on a torch, to reveal a truth he had died trying to protect. The lighthouse, once a beacon of comfort in her childhood, now loomed as a silent, ominous monument to a buried past, waiting for her to uncover its deepest secret. Chapter 5. The Last Transmission. The chilling words from old Henry, hinting at a secret cargo, a critical wartime message, and a suspicious death, resonated with terrifying clarity. Grandfather Ted's life, once a collection of whimsical anecdotes, was now a tapestry woven with espionage and fatal secrets. The North Lighthouse, no longer a childhood sanctuary, felt like a towering monument to a buried truth. Armed with the spyglass and the cryptic parchment, Olivia and Matt finally gained special access to the lighthouse, its automated beacon still sweeping across the Pacific. The air inside was cool, damp, smelling of salt and old machinery. They climbed the winding stairs, the rhythmic sweep of the light above them a constant, unnerving presence. Following the clue, the stone of the guardian, beneath the turning eye, they focused on the very top of the lighthouse, the lantern room. After a meticulous search, behind a loose stone in the very foundation of the light mechanism, they found it, a small, weathered wooden box, tucked away, almost imperceptible. Inside, nestled on a bed of old brittle cloth, was not a material treasure, but something far more potent. A small antique reel-to-reel tape recorder, surprisingly well preserved, and a single unspooled tape. Beside it lay a crumpled, heavily annotated nautical chart of the local coastline, covered in Grandfather Ted's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, Olivia pressed play. The crackle of static filled the small room, then Grandfather Ted's voice, raspy but unmistakable, filled the air, bridging 25 years of silence. "My dearest Liv," his voice began, imbued with a profound urgency. "If you are hearing this, then I have failed, and you, my brave girl, have found my final secret. The North Lighthouse, it was more than just a beacon. During the war, it was part of a clandestine network, a silent sentinel for transmitting coded messages designed to look like routine weather reports. The sea serpent, Liv, it wasn't lost to a storm. It was carrying the final piece of a vital intelligence puzzle, a message that could have changed the course of the war, a message about a double agent, a traitor within the highest ranks of our own government, operating in the Pacific Northwest. He was about to expose a network of saboteurs." Olivia gasped. "A double agent? This went far beyond local legends. I found the last transmission, Liv." Grandfather Ted continued, his voice growing weary. "Hidden in the lighthouse's old logs, disguised as meteorological data, a sequence of numbers, codes, names. It was crucial. But the man, the double agent, he discovered my search. He knew I was close. He came here, to the lighthouse. He told me to stop, to forget it. He said he had people everywhere." A cough, then a tremor in his voice. "He was here, that day, the day they said I drowned. It wasn't an accident, Liv. He pushed me. He took the original logbook, the proof. He thought he had silenced me forever. But I sent the postcard, Liv. My last hope. My last chance to guide you. The truth always finds a way, even across time." He then described how he had quickly recorded this message, hidden the recorder, and slicked a coded copy of the message into the spyglass, knowing it would be lost if he were caught. The message itself, Liv, is encrypted. a cipher based on my old celestial navigation charts. But beware, he still lives. He is old now, but powerful. And he will not want this truth to see the light of day. He is still protecting his legacy of betrayal. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. The code, Liv. It's a family secret. The constellations, the stars. Remember my stories? The truth. It's in the stars, Liv. Our stars. The tape clicked, then went silent. Olivia and Matt sat in stunned silence, the drone of the lighthouse beacon the only sound. Grandfather Ted wasn't a whimsical old man. He was a silent hero, a man who had stumbled upon a national secret and paid the ultimate price. His death had been murder, an act of calculated silencing by a traitor. And the postcard, delayed for 25 years, was his desperate final act of defiance, the posthumous warning, an urgent plea for justice. Olivia, the cynical photographer, was now burdened with a 25-year-old murder and a national secret. And somewhere, still alive, was the man who had killed her grandfather. The true hunt had begun. Chapter 6, Decoding a Legacy of Betrayal. The silence in the lantern room, after Grandfather Ted's voice faded, was deafening. Olivia felt a cold, hard knot of grief and rage tightening in her chest. Her grandfather, her gentle, storytelling grandfather Ted, had been murdered. Not by the sea, but by a ruthless traitor. A man whose dark legacy was still protected after decades. The postcard, the spyglass, the recorder, they were more than clues. They were a posthumous indictment, a cry for justice from beyond the grave. He was killed for this, Olivia whispered, her voice raw. All these years, I thought it was just a terrible accident. Matt, ever the pragmatist, was already focused. The cipher. He said it was based on his celestial navigation charts, a family secret. Our stars, he said. They returned to San Francisco. The tape recorder and the nautical chart Grandfather Ted had annotated, now their most precious possessions. They spread out the chart in Olivia's apartment, its faded lines mapping constellations and obscure celestial movements. Olivia remembered Grandfather Ted's bedtime stories, not fairy tales, but ancient myths about constellations, the names of stars, their specific positions on certain dates. It was a game they used to play, connecting the dots, creating new stories. It took days, fueled by endless cups of coffee and Matt's relentless energy. Olivia's memories of her grandfather's star games slowly unlocked the cipher. Each constellation, each star, corresponded to a letter or a number. It was a complex, elegant code, a testament to Grandfather Ted's brilliance and his belief that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually be found. Finally, the message emerged, chillingly clear. It detailed the identity of the double agent, a man named Arthur Vance, a prominent figure in the Pacific Northwest, seemingly a patriot, but in reality, a spy who had been feeding vital intelligence to the enemy, leading to the loss of Allied ships and lives. The message described his network, his methods, and most crucially, mentioned a hidden cache of documents in his ancestral home that would prove his treason. Grandfather Ted, in his role as a lighthouse keeper, had intercepted a final, desperate transmission meant for Vance, confirming his treachery and the location of the hidden evidence. He had been on the verge of exposing Vance when he was silenced. Arthur Vance, Matt breathed, his eyes wide. He's still alive. An old man now, well into his 90s, a highly respected philanthropist. nobody would ever suspect him. The realization settled heavily upon them. The man who had killed her grandfather, the traitor who had caused so much suffering, was still living a life of privilege and honor. This was no longer just about Grandfather Ted's legacy. It was about exposing a national disgrace, rectifying a profound historical injustice. Their task was clear: gather enough irrefutable evidence to expose Arthur Vance. They couldn't simply present Grandfather Ted's recording and the deciphered message. They needed tangible proof, something that would stand up in court, something that would shatter Vance's carefully constructed facade of respectability. The message pointed to Vance's ancestral home, a sprawling estate on the Washington coast. Olivia, once a detached observer, now felt a fierce, burning resolve. Her photography, once cold and objective, now gained a new depth, a new purpose. She was no longer documenting sterile landscapes. She was chasing a living shadow, capturing the unseen truths that festered beneath the surface of history. The North Lighthouse, a beacon of truth, had transformed her from a cynical artist into a relentless seeker of justice. The final act of Grandfather Ted's heroic life, the last transmission, was now in her hands, and she would ensure its light shone brightly, exposing the darkness that had consumed him. Chapter 7: The Unveiling of Light. The decoded message, naming Arthur Vance as a traitor and a murderer, fueled Olivia with a relentless, consuming fire. Grandfather Ted's heroic pursuit of truth had not been in vain. The cynical shell Olivia had built around her heart began to crack, replaced by a fierce sense of duty and an unshakable connection to her grandfather's unwavering spirit. The trail led directly to Vance's sprawling, secluded estate on the Washington coast, a place shrouded in the whispers of old money and unspoken secrets. Gaining access to Vance's heavily guarded property was a monumental challenge. Matt, with his journalistic instincts, suggested they approach it not as a direct confrontation, but as a subtle investigation, using Olivia's photography as a cover. They posed as architectural photographers interested in documenting historical estates, hoping to find a way to discreetly search for the hidden cache of documents Grandfather Ted had mentioned. Their first attempts were met with polite but firm resistance. Vance, despite his age, remained sharp, his eyes holding a chilling wariness. He was a master of deflection, a man who had honed the art of secrecy for decades. However, through persistent networking and a carefully crafted portfolio of their work, they eventually secured a limited tour of the estate. Once inside, Olivia used her photographic skills not just to capture the beauty of the architecture, but to meticulously scan every detail, looking for anomalies, hidden compartments, anything that matched the vague descriptions in Grandfather Ted's final message. Matt, ever the charmer, engaged Vance's staff, gathering subtle clues about the estate's history and its owner's habits. The breakthrough came in Vance's personal study, a room filled with antique maps and military memorabilia. In the corner, almost hidden behind a large globe, was a small, ornate wooden chest, its lock old and intricate. Grandfather Ted's message had mentioned a chest of secrets bearing the serpent's mark. Olivia noticed a faint, almost invisible carving on the lid, a coiled serpent. That night, after their tour, they devised a plan. Using Matt's contacts, they arranged for a distraction at the estate, a minor technical issue that would require a late-night visit from a repair crew. Under the cover of this manufactured chaos, Olivia and Nat slipped back into the study. With a set of antique lock-picking tools Nat had acquired, they opened the chest. Inside, beneath layers of musty documents, lay the irrefutable proof, a meticulously kept ledger, filled with Vance's own hand, detailing his communications with enemy agents, his financial gains, and horrifyingly, the specific intelligence he had passed on that had led to the destruction of Allied ships and the deaths of countless soldiers. There were also coded letters confirming his deep involvement in the spy ring, and chillingly, a brief, chilling entry detailing his confrontation with Grandfather Ted at the lighthouse, confirming his culpability in the murder. The old fool insisted on playing hero, the entry read, silenced him easily. No one will ever know. Olivia felt a profound, satisfying wave of triumph. This was it, the truth Grandfather Ted had died for. They photographed every page, every document, creating undeniable digital copies. Then, they quietly replaced everything, leaving no trace. They had what they needed. The very next day, they presented their findings to a specially assembled task force within the Department of Justice and the FBI, working with select journalists Nat trusted implicitly. The evidence was overwhelming. Arthur Vance, a revered public figure, was arrested, his carefully constructed life of lies shattering around him. The news exploded, a national scandal that finally brought justice to the forgotten heroes of World War II, and most importantly, to Grandfather Ted. The North Lighthouse, once a symbol of childhood wonder, then of a hidden tragedy, now became a beacon of enduring truth, its light cutting through the darkness of decades of deceit. Olivia visited it again, alone this time. She stood on the catwalk, the wind whipping around her, feeling Grandfather Ted's presence not as a ghost of grief, but as a warm, guiding light. He wasn't just a storyteller. He was a silent hero, a man who believed in the power of truth, a legacy she now carried. Her cynicism had vanished. Her photography, once focused on the cold realities of the world, now sought out the hidden beauty, the resilience of the human spirit, the untold stories of quiet heroism. She specialized in documenting historical injustices, lending her unique eye to those whose truths had been suppressed. She found a profound peace in knowing she had completed his mission, fulfilling the purpose of that impossible postcard. Every now and then, she'd find a small, unexpected sign, a feather on her windowsill, the distinct scent of pipe tobacco on a calm breeze, a reminder that Grandfather Ted was still with her, watching, guiding. The lighthouse stood eternal, its beam a constant symbol of truth, a testament to the fact that even after 25 years, some messages, some loves, some legacies always find their way home.